The story begins with a calm voice, speaking about a certain herbalist. A book is placed on the table, and on its pages, the shadow of a person appears, though it's unclear who it is. The introduction continues, describing the herbalist as someone with a kind heart, always willing to sacrifice for others. The door behind the young man slowly creaks open, revealing an elderly woman. She calls him Leaf, asking if he's there. Leaf warmly welcomes her into the shop. The introduction continues, stating that this is a common greeting from Master Asclepios. In a village near the border, there stands a massive ancient tree. On that particular day, an elderly couple walks together toward Leaf's house. They chat happily with each other, seemingly delighted by something. Even outside Leaf's house, their voices can be heard, constantly expressing their gratitude towards him. From inside, Leaf steps out with a cheerful face, ready to greet his patients. The elderly woman standing at the door quickly mentions that her back suddenly started hurting. Leaf smiles gently and reassures her that it's nothing serious, reminding her that bending over like that will only make it worse. She lowers her head, wanting to confirm what Leaf has said. Leaf consoles her, saying that, well, getting older comes with its challenges. Then, he slows down his speech. Leaf looks up, beaming as he confidently affirms that he and Madame Merlin are close friends. Leaf then sits down at his table to prepare the medicine. Madame Merlin politely thanks him once again, and as Leaf adjusts his chair with a welcoming demeanor, he tells her that he's preparing the usual medicine and asks her to wait for a bit. With a focused expression and skillful hands, Leaf prepares a pain-relieving medicine, demonstrating a level of expertise that suggests he's been in this profession for quite some time. Once the medicine is finally mixed, Leaf wraps it up and places it in a paper bag. He hands the package to Madame Merlin, saying it's the usual remedy along with a pain relief patch. Thoughtfully, he includes an extra portion for Mr. Arthur. Madame Merlin happily accepts it, praising Leaf for his attentiveness. Suddenly, someone cries out for Leaf in distress. Before he can react, a foot strikes him, sending him flying across the room. Much to Madame Merlin's shock, the voice calling out was Dokwana, a beautiful girl who was visibly angry because Leaf had kept her waiting for a long time. She called him trash, and Leaf, startled, shouted her name, Dokuna. Dokwana, still furious, demanded that Leaf quickly prepare her dinner. Terrified by Dokwana's anger, Leaf backed away and asked her to wait a little longer because he was still speaking with a customer. Dokwana, losing her patience, grew even more terrifying than before. She then turned to Madame Merlin, pointed directly at her, and began shouting angrily at her. The kind-hearted Madame Merlin could only apologize to Dokwana, explaining that her back was hurting terribly. Dokwana, however, refused to accept the apology. She didn't care about the reason and told Madame Merlin that she should have come during the shop's open hours, despite the fact that the shop was currently operating within its hours. Madame Merlin, feeling humiliated, kept her head down, repeatedly apologizing. But Dokwana, driven by her hunger, ignored her and continued to criticize. She loudly told Madame Merlin that if she intended to apologize, she shouldn't have come in the first place. Dokwana then turned to blame Leaf, claiming that because he was too soft-hearted, elderly people like Madame Merlin kept taking advantage of him. Leaf, panicking, rushed over to stand between Dokwana and Madame Merlin. Dokwana scowled at Leaf, causing him to tremble in fear. With hands clasped together, Leaf shakily tried to calm Dokwana's anger, pleading with her to give him just a little more time, and he would even prepare dessert for her. Dokwana, taken aback by Leaf's peace offering, paused to think for a moment before agreeing to wait. She turned away, allowing Leaf some time, but didn't forget to remind him sternly. Her cold gaze fixed on Leaf as she warned him that she was serious earlier, reminding him to take heed of her words. As night fell, the street lamps illuminated the road. Leaf accompanied Madame Merlin back home. Along the way, Leaf apologized to her, feeling guilty about the incident. Madame Merlin, however, brushed it off, telling him it was no big deal. With her cane in hand, she walked beside Leaf, who stayed by her side. Madame Merlin then pondered aloud about how Dokwana had grown into such a headstrong young woman, expressing disbelief that Dokwana was the granddaughter of Asclepios. With a puzzled expression, Madame Merlin asked Leaf if he was truly okay with such a fiancé. Flustered, Leaf quickly denied it, asking her not to say such things. After all, they had just been childhood friends. Leaf calmed down and said that Dokwana also had her struggles, so he had to be serious about it. Madame Merlin slowed her steps, gave Leaf a glance, and asked him if he was truly okay with everything. Leaf, confused, didn't quite understand what she was implying and asked for clarification. Madame Merlin, speaking gently as if to her own grandchild, explained that sometimes when she looked at Leaf, she felt that if he left the village, he would surely make a name for himself. Sooner or later, he would become a renowned herbalist. The two of them continued talking in front of the house. Madame Merlin went on to say that staying in such a desolate village seemed like a waste. If Leaf ventured out into the world, they would. She trailed off, not finishing her sentence. Perhaps she was worried that if Leaf left, elderly people like herself wouldn't receive the same level of care they had always relied on from him. Leaf was surprised by Madame Merlin's words, thinking she might be joking. As they slowed their pace, Leaf added that he had always been grateful to his master for taking him in. His voice was filled with deep reverence for his mentor. Standing in front of the house, Leaf spoke with determination. He was a disciple and had to protect the shop. The next morning, sunlight streamed into Leaf's room as he slept soundly in his bed. Suddenly, Dokwana appeared beside his bed, wearing a provocative dress with slits on the sides and a revealing neckline. Standing with her arms crossed, she woke Leaf up. Startled, Leaf jumped out of his sleep, shocked by Dokwana's appearance. Leaf, bewildered, sat up and asked Dokwana what was going on. He looked at her in frustration and remarked that she was being far too casual. He called her an airhead and questioned her about her outfit. Dokwana smirked smugly and told Leaf that she was going to marry the Lord. Her face was full of pride and disdain toward him. Leaf was utterly shocked by Dokwana's declaration. Quickly dressing, he rushed after her, trying to stop her. Meanwhile, inside the shop, a few close servants of the Lord had already arrived, waiting for him and Dokwana. One of the Lord's guards held a box, and inside the box was the ledger that Leaf's master had left behind. Leaf saw the ledger and immediately ran toward it, unable to bear the thought of his master's book being taken by those who didn't deserve it. But the guard calmly turned away and left, causing Leaf to miss his chance and tumble to the ground. Dokwana walked over, grabbed Leaf by the arm, and told him it was too late. She yelled in his face, announcing that from today, the shop belonged to Okaran-sama. The arrogant lord confirmed it, declaring that the pharmacy would now be the property of Lord Watslack. The lord revealed himself, a large man with long curly hair swept upward, a scruffy mustache, and an air of superiority. He introduced himself with authority as Okaran Sin Watslack. Standing before Leaf, he recognized him as the boy Dokwana often mentioned. With confidence, Watslack pulled Dokwana into his embrace, claiming that she suited him far better. Dokwana happily rested her head against Watslack's chest, laughing gleefully. She chirped with joy, telling Watslack how happy she was. Leaf, bewildered, believed that the Lord was carelessly spouting nonsense. Fueled by anger, Leaf stood up and declared that this was his master's shop. But before he could finish, Watslack interrupted him, denying the claim, stating that as the inheritance from his wife's grandfather, the property rightfully belonged to him. The Lord smirked provocatively at Leaf, asserting that everything in the shop was now his. He insulted Leaf, calling him a dirty little brat, while smiling in a way that was sure to infuriate anyone. Leaf's expression darkened, his hope for the shop completely shattered. Dokwana, still clinging to the Lord, constantly showered him with praise. Watslack laughed heartily, satisfied, while Leaf, filled with despair, collapsed to the ground, speechless. Leaf's hand rested on the floor, trembling with anger. Quietly, he muttered under his breath, telling them not to mess with him. His rage was so intense that he clenched his teeth, unwilling to accept what had just happened. The tools he had inherited, the loyal customers, the memories with his master, all of these things flooded back into Leaf's mind. He lost control, shouting at Dokwana and the Lord, demanding to know why they had taken everything from him. Dokwana, losing her patience, snapped at Leaf, shouting that the pharmacy belonged to her grandfather, and that someone like Leaf, who had been discarded, had no claim to it. Leaf's eyes reflected utter defeat, as if his spirit had completely crumbled. He didn't want things to end up like this. Dokwana approached Leaf, calling his name and telling him that she wasn't so cruel. She slowly lifted his chin, speaking with contempt, telling him that a fool like him would die without ever helping anyone. Dokwana squatted down and made an offer. She would hire Leaf as her servant. Leaf lowered his head, humiliated by Dokwana's condescending words. Suddenly, Leaf sprang to his feet, catching Dokwana off guard. He felt powerless against this fame-hungry, greedy girl. He told Dokwana that she could do whatever she wanted. Furious that Leaf disregarded her words, Dokwana reiterated her offer, saying once again that she would hire him. But Leaf simply ignored her and walked away. Watslack quickly stepped forward to stop Dokwana, telling her that enough was enough. As Leaf's silhouette grew smaller in the distance, he made up his mind to leave. Watslack told Dokwana to let Leaf go and called him a lowly man. Leaf walked slowly down the road, his steps heavy with reluctance to leave the place behind. As he walked, he reminisced about the time when his master was still by his side, the praise his master had given him, and the confidence his master had in Leaf's abilities. His master had always reassured Leaf that everything he taught him would be useful. The heartwarming image of the two of them together flashed in Leaf's mind. His master, gentle and devoted, patiently teaching his young apprentice. His master had placed all his faith in Leaf, believing that his future held great promise. Leaf had been a curious and eager student as a child, and his master would affectionately pat his head, praising him. Leaf would tell him not to pat his head, but his master would just laugh heartily at the little boy. Leaf's hands trembled as he clenched them tightly. Overwhelmed with emotion, Leaf broke down, tears streaming down his cheeks. Between sobs, he apologized to his master. Leaf walked on, eventually finding himself deep in the forest. He sat down on a large rock, letting out a long sigh. He sat there, lost in thought, uncertain of what to do next. Leaf worried that if he went to see Madame Merlin, it would only cause her more concern. Now, the young man had no home, no place to return to. Leaf recalled Madame Merlin's words from the night before, saying that if he left the village, he would surely make a name for himself and become a great herbalist one day. Leaf sat in contemplation, perhaps considering the idea of leaving the village for good. Suddenly, Leaf clutched his head and shouted, trying to shake off the thought. He told himself that a country bumpkin like him could never make it in the city. Leaf continued to sit there, holding his head, unable to figure out what to do. Although he didn't want to trouble anyone, he didn't have any money on him and couldn't just wander aimlessly along the roads, living a lonely existence. Leaf suddenly caught the scent of something faint in the air. Surprised, he sniffed around to identify the smell, then followed it, fumbling his way toward the source. The scent led him to the edge of the forest. What greeted Leaf was a grim scene. Bodies sprawled across the ground, severely wounded. One person had lost a leg, blood pooling heavily on the earth. Leaf heard the groans of a soldier and hurried toward him to check on him. The soldier was in too much pain to speak, only able to let out a few groans. Leaf suspected that monsters might have caused this, but something about it seemed strange to him. Just then, a voice came from behind. Startled, Leaf spun around to see what was happening. It was two beautiful girls, supporting each other as they walked toward him. One of them was injured and could barely walk on her own. They noticed Leaf and thought he was just a child, quickly realizing that he was from the village of Deadened. The injured girl started crying and begged Leaf to call someone who could heal them. Leaf seemed confused, not fully understanding what had happened to them. The injured girl explained that they had been traveling to the village when they were attacked by monsters along the way. Without answering, Leaf turned to look at the wounded people lying on the ground, seemingly lost in thought. The girl became puzzled and asked what Leaf was planning. Calmly, Leaf reached into the bag he carried with him, searching for something, and told the two girls that there was no need to call anyone. From his bag, Leaf pulled out several leaves, herbs that he had brought along. He gathered all the herbs into the palm of his hand, using all his strength to compress them tightly. He then placed them on the wounded soldiers. Suddenly, a blinding light shone, much to the astonishment of the two girls. The injuries began to heal slowly, as if nothing had ever happened. The two girls couldn't believe what they were seeing and thought it must be magic. Leaf stood up slowly and denied it. Leaf then turned to them with a bright smile and said it was just medicine. One of the girls blushed, touched by Leaf's kindness, enthusiasm, and warmth. However, the stronger-looking girl wasn't convinced. She didn't believe it was just medicine. Leaf's extraordinary healing abilities seemed incomprehensible to her. The soldiers, once healed, were ecstatic, as if they had fully recovered. Leaf, feeling shy, told them not to be so amazed. As for the stronger girl, she couldn't believe what had just happened. She shouted, claiming that there was no way she could be fooled. She firmly believed that no medicine could heal a severed arm like that. She got right in Leaf's face, accusing him of trying to put something strange into their bodies. Leaf panicked and denied it. Flustered, Leaf tried to explain, but the girl pointed straight at him, insisting that no matter how skilled a healer was, no one could perform such a miracle. She then called out to the young lady beside her, revealing that the other girl was of noble status. Leaf was shocked when he heard the title. The young lady approached Leaf, her face turning red as she thanked him for his help. She expressed gratitude for his kindness in assisting strangers like them, calling him a truly compassionate person. The young lady was so overjoyed that she even acknowledged the rumors comparing Leaf to a god. However, Leaf was curious about the identities of these two. The young lady blushed and apologized to Leaf for being late with her introduction. She introduced herself as Priscilla Van Graham, the daughter of Duke Graham. Leaf was visibly surprised by her status. Priscilla continued, explaining that she had heard rumors about Leaf and, in her desperate situation, had traveled from the capital to seek him out. Suddenly, Priscilla took hold of Leaf's hands and declared that this must be fate. The two stood facing each other, their hands clasped together. Priscilla called Leaf the holy herbalist of Deadened Village. She then quickly extended an invitation, asking if Leaf would be willing to accompany them to the capital. It was only then that Leaf snapped back to reality. He looked down at his hands in shock and cried out in surprise, as this was the first time he had ever held a girl's hand. Leaf blushed and apologized to Priscilla, explaining that he usually only interacted with elderly people. Priscilla quickly apologized in return for acting so rudely. Leaf reassured her that it was fine, and besides, he wasn't the holy herbalist she thought he was. Priscilla looked confused. Leaf explained that the person she was referring to might have been his late master, Asclepios. Priscilla was shocked to hear that the revered holy herbalist had passed away. Leif then told Priscilla the full story. Afterward, he hesitantly asked her what someone like him, who had no place to go, should do. At that moment, a pack of wolves surrounded them, though Leif was still unaware. The strong-willed girl shouted a warning about the wolves, and only then did Leif realize the danger. They had been surrounded by a pack of massive wolves, the same ones that had attacked them earlier. This time, the wolves had brought reinforcements. Priscilla was terrified, while Lilith, the strong-willed girl, bravely stepped forward to protect her. Determined, Lilith declared that they had no other choice but to fight, although even battling one wolf earlier had nearly defeated them. Now, facing an entire pack was a much bigger problem. The soldiers were helpless, knowing they stood no chance against the wolves. Lilith, however, remained resolute, determined to protect her lady. Meanwhile, Leif remained surprisingly calm in the face of the wolves, wondering why these pups were here. Priscilla was frantic with worry for Leif, while Lilith ordered him to step back. She warned that, no matter how skilled he was, a herbalist without combat abilities couldn't possibly. Before Lilith could finish, one of the wolves lunged at Leif, jaws wide open. But Leif quickly grabbed some herbs from his bag, once again compressing the leaves tightly in his hands. Suddenly, the wolves froze in place. It turned out that Leif had applied a numbing poison to them. Lilith was in disbelief, but Leif calmly explained that the basics of using medicinal herbs were the method and the proper dosage. However, if overlooked, it could be potent even for a herbalist. Leif clenched his fists, preparing a lethal concoction. His hands turned a dark color, and then, in a swift movement, he charged toward the wolves. Priscilla recalled a story her mother had told her, a tale of a legendary holy herbalist who had once saved the entire world on his own. It was said that even now, the holy herbalist was still out there, watching over everyone. In a flash, Leif had already subdued the wolves. His brave and fearless demeanor left everyone in awe. Everyone was relieved and joyful, but Lilith still couldn't accept it. Leif calmly walked forward, stating that he was just Leif, a novice still far behind his master. Feeling shy, Leif asked if he could join them on their journey to the capital. On the map, Deadened is a village near the northern border of the kingdom, also known as the Heroes' Village. It is home to former heroes, high-level wizards, and legendary sword saints. This is the story of a young man from the Heroes' Village, destined to become known across the world. Suddenly, a scene from the past flashed through Leif's mind. In it, he slapped an old man on the back, sticking a piece of paper on him, with the words "Crazy Old Man" written on it. Leif loudly declared that he didn't want to be a herbalist anymore. The old man, annoyed by Leif's attitude, called him a snot-nosed brat. Leif continued to tease, saying even louder that he didn't want to be a herbalist and mocked his master, calling him stupid. It turned out to be just a fragment of memory that resurfaced as Leif traveled with Graham to the capital. Noticing that Leif had fallen silent, Graham asked if something was bothering him. Leif, feeling embarrassed, stammered and apologized, explaining that he was just thinking about a few things. Graham, seeing Leif's awkwardness, reassured him, saying there was no need to apologize so profusely. Then Leif asked the group why they had come to visit his master. A girl with short, edgy hair spoke up, expressing disbelief. She then turned to Priscilla, questioning why she would invite someone with an unclear background to the palace, saying it was incredibly dangerous. Graham sharply scolded her, calling Lilith rude. He firmly replied that they had seen with their own eyes Leif's healing abilities, which he had inherited from the holy herbalist, and that they could only rely on him. Lilith hesitated, offering a half-hearted apology, while keeping her gaze fixed on the road ahead, as it seemed the path had become a bit perilous. Suddenly, the carriage tilted and Lilith anxiously asked Priscilla if she was all right. However, in the chaos, Lilith accidentally fell, almost landing on Leif. The two of them found themselves in a compromising position. Flustered, Lilith quickly stood up and shouted, asking what Leif thought he was doing. Leif, utterly embarrassed, hastily apologized to Lilith, explaining that it was just an accident and unavoidable. Lilith, however, remained suspicious, openly accusing him of still being a perverted scoundrel at heart. Lilith still wanted to go back and verify Leif's identity. But suddenly, Madame Merlin appeared, floating in the air, vouching for Leif's abilities. Everyone was shocked by her unexpected presence. The young lady quickly recognized her as the great sage who had helped the heroes defeat the Demon King's army, and none other than Merlin Carter Sama. Madame Merlin humbly replied that the young lady was exaggerating her accomplishments. Graham, filled with admiration, stated that the magic earlier was proof of her legendary status, and that meeting Merlin was a great honor. Graham then turned to Lilith, asking her if this was enough to prove that Leif-san was trustworthy. Embarrassed, Lilith admitted she had been disrespectful toward Leif Dono. However, she still grabbed Leif by the collar, warning him that she wouldn't forgive his earlier lewd behavior and called him a pervert. Leif defended himself, insisting it wasn't his fault. Madame Merlin expressed relief that everything had turned out well, explaining that she had been worried after hearing the story from the fools who told her. Leif apologized for causing her concern, stating that no matter how hard he tried, he could never be as good as his master. In the wild, mountainous scenery, Merlin gently caressed the young man's cheek, telling him that he had worked hard and didn't need to belittle himself. Leif shared that a bright future was awaiting him. After that, Merlin raised Leif's master's robe. Those around them looked on with suspicion. Leif revealed that he was the abandoned child whom his master had taken in and raised alongside Do Kwana. He confessed that, at first, he didn't think being a herbalist was cool. But as he followed in his master's footsteps, he gradually began to admire the profession without even realizing it. But suddenly, Madame Merlin interrupted him, saying that she had planned to give this to him after he had made a name for himself. But she felt that now was the right time. She handed him the robe, with the same piece of paper from all those years ago still attached. Leif's emotions overflowed, and he wiped his eyes before quickly thanking her. He had thought he had lost his home and his place in the world, but now he realized he still had this place. Clutching the robe tightly in his arms, he said that without him, things might be a bit difficult for everyone, but adventuring had always been his dream. Then, filled with excitement and hope, Leif declared that he would travel the world, becoming like his master in his youth, and experience life as a herbalist. Merlin supported Leif, encouraging him to do whatever made him happy because it was his life. After saying that, she pulled out a few items, telling him they were parting gifts. Merlin revealed that she knew he might need money, so she had prepared for such a situation. Leif responded confidently that he would definitely earn money on his own. Finally, Merlin sat on her broom and told him not to worry about them and to do his best. Then, she flew away. Leif waved goodbye, saying that he no longer had any concerns. Before she left, Merlin whispered that she would take care of things here. Leif was about to ask what she meant, but she disappeared so quickly he couldn't. As they sat on the carriage, Priscilla mentioned to Lilith and Leif that they were about to leave the forest. Lilith, in her usual manner, instructed Leif not to cry or anything like that. But Leif confidently donned the robe his master had left him and assured her that he wouldn't. For Leif, his adventure truly began at that moment. Suddenly, he exclaimed in surprise upon seeing a gigantic lizard. Leif, still naive, remarked that he hadn't realized such large lizards existed outside the village. Lilith quickly interrupted, telling him that it was a dragon, not a lizard, as he thought. The dragon turned, glaring at Leif, and growled, "How dare a foolish human like you call the Dragon King a lizard? Such shame." Lilith pondered for a moment, questioning why the dragon could speak human language, and why such an ancient creature was here, as it was a mythical level beast. The dragon then asked Leif who he was. In response, Leif confidently declared, "I'm a herbalist." The dragon then challenged Leif to face its flames. At that moment, Lady Graham clung tightly to Lilith, both of them bracing for the worst, waiting for death without resistance. Lilith was filled with despair, reflecting on her life. But then, Leif had the chance to showcase his talent. He swiftly mixed up a formula, followed by a strength-boosting medicine. The scene became one of a fierce and intense battle. The dragon, still undefeated, loomed large, but Leif remained resolute, determined to protect everyone. He unleashed a powerful punch and a dose of stimulant. In the end, the dragon met its demise at Leif's hands. Lilith looked on with a smug expression. Leif proudly stated that, thanks to his master's cloak, he finally felt like a real herbalist. Lilith shouted, asking whether any herbalist could possibly be like him. Then Graham mentioned that there was only one reason they sought his help and promised to explain further at the estate. She wanted Leif to examine someone who was ill. As they left the mountains and forests behind, magnificent castles and towering fortresses came into view, signaling that they had arrived at the capital. The streets were bustling with people, carriages, and horses, and the grand, majestic buildings left people breathless. All sorts of individuals appeared, dressed in vibrant, elaborate outfits. The lively, glamorous atmosphere was exactly what one would expect from a capital city. For Leif, this was the first time he had ever seen the capital, and this place, full of promise, was bound to change the course of his life. The tightly packed houses surprised Leif, as back in his village, it would take him 10 minutes just to walk to his neighbor's house when he needed to deliver a notice. Leif, full of curiosity, asked countless questions, much to the annoyance of Lilith, who felt embarrassed and flustered by his naive comments. She angrily shouted at him to lower his voice, worried someone might overhear. Leif smiled innocently, explaining that it was his first time seeing so many new things, scratching his head in embarrassment. Lilith stormed off, reminding him to behave properly when they met with Cypher Sama. Leif, puzzled by the unfamiliar name, asked who that was. Annoyed by his endless questions, Lilith explained that Cypher was the father of Prisha Sama. Leif didn't think much of it, assuming that Cypher would just be a kind, cheerful, and warm man like Prisha, and he reminded himself to be on his best behavior and not cause any trouble. When they arrived at the estate, Leaf was even more overwhelmed than when they had reached the capital. The entire place was dazzling, with strict security on either side. The guards were dressed like royal knights, exuding power and dignity. As they ventured deeper inside, they approached a podium where a middle-aged man stood, his face radiating authority. Standing strong in a nobleman's attire, Duke Cypher Sama wore a sophisticated outfit adorned with gold-fringed epaulettes on both shoulders, emphasizing the stark difference in rank between him and the commoners outside. When he warmly welcomed Prishta back, relieved that she was safe, Leaf finally snapped out of his daze and realized that he was standing in the estate of the Duke, meeting a man second only to the royal family. Leaf felt a mix of confusion and nervousness, unsure of what to say. The only other time he had encountered nobility was when he met Okuran Sama at his master's apothecary. Okuran's arrogance and disdain for Leaf had left a lasting impression on him, and this pulled him back to reality, reminding him that, in the end, he was just a dirty commoner, unworthy of the praise Prisha had given him. Surely, people would assume he had ulterior motives for getting close to her. Meanwhile, Prisha explained to her father that despite the hardships of the journey, the result was well worth it, and she introduced Leaf to him. At that moment, Leaf could only stammer and tremble, unsure of what to say. To his complete shock, the Duke knelt before him, a gesture that utterly terrified him. The Duke begged Leaf to help them, pleading for him to lend them his strength. Leaf was then invited to sit at a tea table, where he was treated with great respect. He nervously asked everyone what exactly was going on. He recalled that Prisha had mentioned bringing him to the capital to help treat someone, and now it became clear who that person was. Prisha explained that her mother, a renowned and powerful mage, had always been in excellent health, dignified and strong, never falling ill. But a month ago, she suddenly collapsed and lost consciousness. Since then, her condition had only worsened, and she remained bedridden. Leaf finally began to understand part of the story and asked if the doctors had examined her and determined what the illness was. Prisha responded that many highly skilled doctors had been summoned, but none could determine what was wrong with her mother. The chief physician of the medical guild suggested that it might be stress-related, but they needed to observe her further. So far, their findings had been inconclusive, as the doctor had said. Hearing that the illness would only worsen, Leaf felt anxious and worried. If the best doctors in the capital couldn't figure out the illness, how could he? Prisha, overwhelmed with emotion, recalled moments with her mother and tearfully begged Leaf to save her. Her father also bowed, sincerely pleading for him to save his wife. This left Leaf feeling confused and torn, as he realized that although they were nobles, they were incredibly kind and respectful toward everyone, including someone as poor as him. Moved by their kindness, Leaf promised that he would do his best to save Diane, Prisha's mother. This made both father and daughter overjoyed, and they repeatedly expressed their gratitude, holding Leaf's hands and thanking him profusely. The Duke then ordered his guards to take Leaf to his wife's room. As they walked, Leaf thought about his master and the duty of healers like himself. He silently vowed to his master that he would save Diane no matter what. Just as they were about to knock on the door to her room, someone called out from a distance, telling them to wait. It turned out to be Bacchus, a doctor from the royal palace, who had just arrived after hearing about Diane's condition. The Duke was both surprised and touched, wondering how such a famous royal doctor had come to examine his wife. Bacchus boasted that he was the most outstanding and youngest doctor in the royal court, a specialist in all forms of illnesses. Hearing such grand introductions, the Duke, desperate to save his wife, eagerly invited Bacchus in to examine her, forgetting all about Leaf for the moment. Prisha, feeling awkward, apologized to Leaf before rushing inside with them. Now Leaf felt utterly lost and unsure of what to do. He thought to himself, of course the doctors in the capital are far more skilled. They don't need an old-fashioned herbalist like me. He wondered if the arrival of this exceptional doctor meant that he no longer had a role to play. Lost in thought, Leaf was startled when he heard someone call his name from a distance. It was Bacchus, who asked why Leaf was still standing there. He urged Leaf to come inside quickly. Leaf remained frozen, confused, as Bacchus called out again, asking if Leaf was an apprentice doctor and telling him to come in and learn as much as he liked. Leaf reluctantly accepted the situation, thinking to himself that the doctor seemed to be quite kind. As they walked inside, Bacchus reminded Leaf not to get in the way. Leaf remained silent and followed him. They entered the patient's room, where many doctors were already gathered around. Suddenly, Prisha exclaimed, "Mother!" Both Leaf and Bacchus apologized to everyone for their late arrival. Bacchus asked about Prisha's mother's condition, and indeed, there had been no improvement. The doctors present expressed their relief that the other doctor had arrived because they felt powerless on their own. Bacchus sighed and simply responded, "I see." He then looked at the patient's medical chart. The more he read, the quieter he became. In the room, both Cypher and his daughter Priscia waited in the hope that a miracle would save their beloved Diane, the wife and mother. Suddenly, Bacchus stated that he understood the situation. Everyone in the room was taken aback, praising him as a royal doctor for his speed. Lord Cypher immediately asked if his wife, Diane, would be okay. Bacchus calmly reassured him to listen to what he had to say, revealing that Diane Sama was suffering from a disease called emmancy. He went on to explain that emmancy was an incurable disease. It deteriorated the kidneys and heart, with a 100% fatality rate. Current medical knowledge could not stop its progression. Lord Cypher was stunned, declaring, "That can't be true. Wasn't there a special medicine for this in the past?" Bacchus replied that the ingredients for the medicine were believed to have disappeared during the Great War between the hero and the Demon King, and even he had never seen them. Hearing this, Priscia reacted unexpectedly, causing both Leaf and Cypher to turn toward her. She was devastated and couldn't believe her mother would die. At this point, Lord Cypher also fell into deep despair. Bacchus stood quietly, looking at the patient, while the other doctors in the room bowed their heads in silence, their eyes filled with sorrow. Breaking the somber atmosphere, Leaf raised his hand and said, "If it's the emmancy disease, it can be cured." Upon hearing this, everyone in the room was stunned. Suddenly, Bacchus shouted at Leaf, reminding him that he had told him not to get in the way. Leaf tried to say something more, but hesitated. Bacchus forcefully stated that without the special medicine, there was no way to cure the disease, and that this was an undeniable truth. Then, Leaf cheerfully and nonchalantly said that he had the ingredient, leaving Bacchus speechless. Leaf showed Bacchus the ingredient, causing him to exclaim in surprise at its vibrant colors, exquisite shape, and the fragrant aroma that filled the room. There was no doubt. This was the real Shinjuku leaf. Bacchus, shocked, asked how Leaf had managed to obtain such a rare item. Leaf, smiling, responded that it grew in the garden behind his house. Bacchus couldn't believe it, questioning whether such a rare herb could be found deep in the mountains. However, Leaf said they wouldn't be using it, because he concluded that Diane Sama did not have emmancy disease. This statement left both Lord Cypher and Priscia stunned. Even Bacchus, a royal doctor, was in disbelief, but Leaf simply added that it was just his guess. Bacchus yelled at Leaf to stop messing around, insisting that now was not the time for jokes. Leaf calmly replied, "But isn't it strange?" Confused, Bacchus asked, "What do you mean, strange?" Leaf explained that the disease seemed to be progressing unusually fast. Bacchus froze upon hearing this. He quickly grabbed Diane's medical file and reviewed it again. The record stated that Diane had fallen into a coma just 1 month ago, which was indeed much faster than a typical case of emmancy disease. Bacchus wondered to himself how Leaf knew about the specific characteristics of this illness. Suddenly, Leaf asked to see the medical file. Bacchus handed it to him, lost in thought. Bacchus was deeply curious about this young man, Leaf, with such knowledge and quick judgment, not to mention possessing the ingredient for the special medicine. It was clear that Leaf was no ordinary person. Despite this, Bacchus remained arrogant, confident in his own diagnosis, declaring that this was undoubtedly emmancy disease. Then, Leaf suggested that perhaps it wasn't even a disease at all. Bacchus was left speechless by Leaf's statement, struggling to comprehend it. He kept his thoughts to himself, as Leaf requested a small sample of Diane's blood. Bacchus, confused, asked Leaf what he was doing. Leaf replied that it was an antidote test. Suddenly, the syringe reacted strangely, and Leaf exclaimed, "Just as I thought." It turned out that what was tormenting Diane was actually a curse. Bacchus was stunned by Leaf's diagnosis, and the other doctors in the room were surprised, whispering among themselves about what this curse could be. Could it be something used by the demons? Leaf explained that Bacchus' earlier words had given him a clue. In fact, no one had seen this type of poison since the Great War long ago. The demons had created this poison to curse and kill humans, and its symptoms closely mimicked those of emmancy disease. However, the poison gradually worsened by draining the patient's magic power. Leaf further explained that since Diane was a renowned mage of the royal court, the symptoms were progressing much faster than normal. Bacchus, still incredulous, retorted that Leaf was like an amateur showing off in front of an expert. Immediately, Leaf apologized, saying he might have overstepped his bounds. Bacchus seemed ready to say something else, and Leaf was visibly nervous at Bacchus' reaction. But unexpectedly, Bacchus placed both hands on Leaf's shoulders and praised him, telling him that he had truly impressed him. Leaf was left dumbfounded, unsure of what was happening. He had expected to be scolded, not praised. Bacchus went on to commend Leaf's vast knowledge, asking if he had studied diligently. Leaf was in disbelief that a royal doctor was complimenting him. Bacchus then asked, "So, can it be cured?" Leaf hesitated before responding that it could, but breaking the curse would take some time and required extremely delicate and meticulous work. Bacchus reminded Leaf that there wasn't much time left, and Leaf suddenly realized just how urgent the situation was. In his mind, Leaf thought about how he had brought some herbs to break the curse, but given the rapid progression of the disease, he feared that what he had might not be enough. Unsure of what to do next, Leaf suddenly had an epiphany. He shouted that he might have found something. As he rummaged through a cabinet, Prisha mentioned that it was a farewell gift from Merlin Sama, and Lord Cypher recognized it too. Leaf held the item up high and declared that he would use it to cure Diane. It was Leaf's mystical staff, and for the first time, the technique of divine healing was about to be witnessed. Leaf raised the staff and proclaimed that he would use it to heal Diane. Bacchus, in disbelief, looked at Leaf and asked, "A staff? Are you kidding me?" Leaf smiled and shoved a small vial in his hand, telling everyone to watch closely. He then dripped a few drops from the vial onto his staff. Leaf began the healing process, raising the staff to channel the medicine. A bright light radiated powerfully from the staff, so intense that no one could look directly at it. This was the legendary healer's divine staff. Everyone was in shock, unable to believe their eyes. The princess, reacting the fastest, immediately noticed the change in the queen's condition. Her complexion had significantly improved. Leaf began explaining that, like all medicine, it must be administered in the correct dosage to be effective. However, his healer's divine staff possessed an exceptional power, allowing him to easily control the exact dosage with a simple wave. Each time the staff was used, the correct amount of medicine would be dispensed, and none of it would be wasted. Princess Priscilla, her eyes sparkling with admiration, marveled at how amazing the staff was, calling it a miraculous tool. Bacchus, trembling with excitement, rushed over to Leaf, bombarding him with questions about how he obtained such a powerful item. He begged to try it, but Leaf refused. Bacchus, disappointed, asked why, accusing Leaf of being stingy, reminding him that they were friends. Leaf, confused, wondered when they had become friends. At that moment, the queen, Diane, awoke and called out her daughter's name, Priscilla. Priscilla's eyes widened in disbelief as she saw her mother had regained consciousness. Queen Diane began to look around and saw her husband. Upon realizing that his wife had woken up, the king called her name, his body trembling with joy. Diane had many questions, but before she could speak, Priscilla jumped onto the bed, hugging her mother tightly, exclaiming how wonderful it was that she had recovered. Tears streamed down Priscilla's face as she gripped the bed sheets, repeating, "It's so good, so good." Her voice trembled as she kept calling out, "Mother, mother!" Everyone, from the queen to Leaf, smiled warmly, witnessing the heartfelt reunion of the queen, princess, and king. Leaf then assured them that the healing process was going smoothly and that Diane would need to rest for a while. Her strength and magic would gradually recover. As he finished speaking, the king and Princess Priscilla expressed their heartfelt thanks to him. Priscilla cheerfully suggested to her father that they should host a grand banquet in Leaf's honor. The king, smiling, readily agreed, but Leaf, panicking, quickly tried to stop them. Even though they insisted that not doing so would weigh on their conscience, Leaf firmly refused, saying, "No, please don't worry about that." He smiled sweetly, explaining that he was simply doing what any teacher would do. Seeing his smile, a spark seemed to light up in Priscilla's eyes. The king grabbed Leaf's hand and, with tears streaming down his face, asked, "Do you know how kind-hearted you are?" His nose was running, and Leaf was visibly flustered by the display of emotions. The king insisted that, at the very least, Leaf should stay the night and receive the reward he so rightfully deserved. This time, Leaf agreed. While standing behind them was Princess Priscilla. Her gaze toward him had changed slightly, her cheeks flushed, as though she was deep in thought about something. Later that night in the brightly lit castle, a glass of wine was placed on the table with a clink, followed by a voice saying, "Hey, young man." It was Bacchus, who was already tipsy from drinking. His right arm draped over Leaf's shoulder, and he showered him with praise, saying how amazing it was that Leaf had broken the curse. Leaf reminded him that he had had too much to drink, but Bacchus shrugged it off, saying it was fine for tonight. Bacchus went on to say that tonight was special, because it marked the anniversary of the first time he had tasted defeat. He said this with a confident grin as he ran a hand through his hair, leaving Leaf at a loss for words. Bacchus continued, speaking dramatically about how he never expected to witness a curse with his own eyes, and then mentioned that there was something he still wondered about. How had the curse been absorbed by Diane? His words made Leaf pause, clearly unsettled. Leaf remained silent for a moment, which piqued Bacchus' curiosity, prompting him to call out to Leaf again. Leaf, now serious, asked Bacchus to promise to keep what he was about to say a secret, making Bacchus sober up slightly. Leaf began by recounting a case that had happened in another country, where someone had been murdered using eye drops. The eye drops contained a compound that constricted blood vessels. In small doses, it was harmless, but in larger doses, it became toxic. Bacchus began to recall a case where a murder had been disguised as death by exhaustion. in which a wife had secretly mixed eye drops into her husband's drink. He asked Leaf how this related to the current situation. Leaf explained that the curse was likely administered in a similar manner. At this moment, Bacchus became frightened, realizing that the curse had been mixed with a drink. Leaf confirmed his suspicion, adding that the person who poisoned Diane was likely someone close to her. In the room where Queen Diane was resting, a small, delicate hand gently touched her face. It was Princess Priscilla. She caressed her mother's cheek and softly asked if she remembered telling her stories about the legendary healer when she was young. She remarked that the rumors were true. Although the healer had passed away, he had a disciple. That disciple had saved her mother. Priscilla marveled at how skilled he was, adding that he wasn't just talented, but also kind and cool. Then, realizing what she had been saying, she blushed in embarrassment. Just then, someone entered the room and asked if she was there alone. It was Rudak. Priscilla replied that she was staying by her mother's side tonight and asked if he was looking for Lilith. Noting that Lilith wasn't there, Rudak calmly responded, "I see." He then flashed a twisted smile and muttered, "Well then, this is convenient. Now we can bury them properly." Priscilla looked confused, not understanding what he meant, while Diane remained sound asleep. The truth was now clear. The real culprit behind the poisoning was the butler, Rudak, and both Priscilla and Diane were in grave danger. Priscilla, still bewildered, asked Rudak what he was talking about. He remained silent for a moment, then muttered, "How troublesome." He repeated the word troublesome over and over again, and suddenly his appearance began to change. This transformation left Priscilla horrified. Rudak's form twisted and shifted as he revealed his true identity, a demon. He roared that he had almost succeeded in killing Diane. Priscilla, frozen in terror, realized that he was one of the demons. Rudak lamented his bad luck at having his plan to poison Diane exposed, complaining that his plot to overthrow the kingdom had now been derailed. Seeing the princess's terrified expression, he casually apologized, stating that he no longer had time to keep up his human disguise. He then coldly added, "I'm afraid you'll have to die for me, princess," assuring her that Leaf wouldn't make it in time. In response to the princess's confusion, Rudak maliciously explained that Leaf had already passed to the afterlife because he had poisoned the tea Leaf drank. His cruel words caused the princess to exclaim, "How heartless." She couldn't believe that Leaf was gone. Before Priscilla could imagine the worst, Rudak was ready to strike, now that nothing was standing in his way. Despite her fear, Priscilla bravely stepped forward, standing in front of her mother's bed. With a determined voice, she declared that she wouldn't let him harm her mother. Tears streaming down her face, Priscilla stood firm despite her trembling. Rudak found amusement in her fear, mockingly laughing at her display of family love, saying that it was meaningless to him. He then lunged forward, intending to kill the princess, who dared to stand in his way. Priscilla, terrified, closed her eyes tightly and whispered Leaf's name in her heart. At that very moment, a powerful kick landed squarely on Rudak's face, sending him crashing into the wall, creating a large hole and flinging him outside. Priscilla, shocked, gasped, "Leaf." After the flawless kick, Leaf landed gracefully and calmly remarked that he hadn't expected the demon to reveal his true form so easily. Rudak growled in disbelief, wondering how Leaf was still alive. He had seen with his own eyes that Leaf had drunk the poisoned tea. But how? Hearing Rudak's confusion, Leaf innocently scratched his head and asked, "Poison? I didn't notice that." His nonchalant response left Rudak speechless. Leaf chuckled sheepishly and apologized, explaining that poison simply didn't work on him, leaving Rudak utterly baffled. Still calm, Leaf explained that after training under his master, he had become immune to all forms of poison. He laughed lightheartedly, while Rudak stood silent, unsure how to react. Then, without warning, Rudak launched a sudden attack, shouting, "You think a healer is all that impressive?" Leaf dodged, and Rudak's fist smashed into the ground, shattering it. Confident in his strength, Rudak boasted that no demon would ever lose in a test of strength. He sneered, daring Leaf to use his healing magic against him, and continued smashing his fists into the ground, laughing wildly. Despite the ground crumbling beneath him, Leaf remained standing, unaffected by the attacks. Rudak, now visibly surprised, couldn't comprehend how Leaf was still unharmed by his relentless assaults. Seeing the deep, resolute look in Leaf's eyes, Rudak panicked internally. His attacks had no effect. No, he quickly realized that Leaf had instant regenerative abilities. As Rudak stood there, his face full of shock, Leaf calmly explained that it was a catalyst that had maximized the human body's natural healing capabilities. Rudak's face still showed disbelief as he remained uncertain about Leaf's true power. Without giving Rudak more time to react, Leaf held up a handful of herbs and remarked, "This is how you deal with poison." Rudak was immediately alarmed. Suddenly, he collapsed as his nervous system was paralyzed by the herbs. Rudak struggled to support himself on the ground, internally complaining about the discomfort. He couldn't move. At this point, the tables had turned. Rudak was now lying helpless on the ground, while Leaf stood tall before him. No longer arrogant, Rudak began to beg for his life, pleading, "Save me. I was wrong. I won't do anything like this again. I'll return to the demon world, so please, spare my life. Don't kill me." Under the vast, starry night sky in front of the magnificent palace, Leaf casually commented, "What a beautiful night." Rudak, confused by the shift in conversation, didn't understand what was happening. Leaf continued, "Did you know? In medicine, it's believed that during a full moon, blood vessels can become constricted, causing mood swings." Then, he asked Rudak, "So what should we do about that?" Rudak, now terrified, pleaded, "Wait, what are you going to do? Stop, please, stop." Ignoring his desperate pleas, Leaf decisively performed a technique, a detoxifying massage, a skill unique to a true healer. Rudak's body hit the ground hard, his nose bleeding profusely. But in his mind, he couldn't help but think, "This feels so good." After experiencing this strange sensation of pleasure, Rudak transformed into a small demon, humbly apologizing and begging Leaf to let him return to his homeland. Leaf gently advised him not to engage in evil deeds again, adding with a friendly smile, "Because there won't be it next time." Trembling at Leaf's words, Rudak agreed and hurriedly flew away. At that moment, Priscilla came running out from her mother's room and saw Leaf kneeling on the shattered ground. Noticing her approach, Leaf sheepishly apologized for the mess he had made. The princess, with tears still glistening on her face, didn't say a word and rushed forward to embrace him tightly. Leaf was completely flustered, unsure of what to do as Priscilla poured out her gratitude to him. Once again, he had saved her, and in her eagerness, he was left overwhelmed, not knowing how to respond. Determined, Priscilla insisted that she had to repay him, saying she wouldn't be able to feel at peace otherwise. She asked if that would be okay, and Leaf's face turned bright red, his head spinning with confusion, unable to say a coherent word. But in the face of her resolute words, all he could manage to say was that he understood and asked her to please let go of him. The scene shifted to a warm place where steam was rising, and clear water flowed from the mouth of a stone lion. Leaf sat in the bath, covering himself with a towel, waiting anxiously. His heart was racing, and sweat poured down his face, not just from the heat of the bath, but from something else. Somehow, both he and Priscilla had ended up naked in the bath, and this was where her attempt to repay him began. Priscilla, wearing only a towel, knelt on the floor with her face flushed. She shyly asked for permission to repay him. Hearing this, Leaf's thoughts became jumbled, and he couldn't form a coherent sentence. His face grew even redder as he tried to make sense of how things had escalated to this point. Sensing his flustered state, Priscilla softly reassured him not to think too much about it, saying it was just her way of expressing thanks. Then, she placed her hand on his back, causing Leaf to jump in surprise. With a gentle voice, she whispered in his ear, telling him to relax. At that moment, Leaf's mind was close to exploding. He mumbled something about how intense her gratitude was, since this was the first time he had experienced anything like this. Priscilla, blushing even more, admitted that it was her first time doing something like this as well. Priscilla had mustered all her courage to offer something in return for Leaf's kindness, and with a bit of embarrassment, she asked if he disliked it. Leaf, flustered, quickly shook his head, denying that he disliked it. But as he did so, Priscilla's towel slipped down. Her chest pressed against his back as she gently whispered in his ear, "You've worked so hard today. Let me help you relax." At that moment, Leaf wanted to scream. It was all too much for him. Suddenly, he stood up, startling Priscilla, and hastily protested, saying that what she was doing was strange. But in his panic, he didn't realize that as he stood, his towel fell, exposing everything. Priscilla's eyes were immediately drawn to the sight, and she exclaimed, "Oh my God!" Leaf, mortified, let out a loud "ah" and frantically ran away. Priscilla, still in shock, called after him, telling him to wait, saying that she felt strange, as if she were gravely ill. Hearing this, Leaf froze and asked, "Ill?" Priscilla gently explained that it was a very dangerous illness called love. Leaf was left speechless, a giant question hanging in his mind. Blushing, Priscilla continued, stammering but ultimately confessing that she had fallen in love with him. At this moment, Leaf's hand, which Priscilla was holding, trembled. Mustering all her courage, despite her nervousness, Priscilla finally revealed her heart, asking him to marry her. She expressed that she wanted to be with him for the rest of her life. But before she could finish pouring out her feelings, Leaf, his voice low, apologized. This made Priscilla stop mid-sentence. Seeing her pause, Leaf began to explain, asking if she remembered what he had told Lady Merlin, that he still had things to do. He needed to travel to many places, meet many people, and experience many things to expand his knowledge. Although her face showed a hint of sadness, her eyes remained steady, looking at him with affection. Leaf, with determination in his voice, declared that one day he would become a great healer like his master, and for now, that was his only focus. His words caused her eyes to waver, but soon her face brightened as she seemed to admire his resolve. Leaf then clarified that his rejection wasn't because he disliked her, or for any other reason. He explained that their social statuses were different, but before he could finish, Priscilla grabbed his face and pulled him close, leaving him stunned and unable to complete a sentence. She then let him go, telling him that she understood his thoughts. Smiling brightly, Priscilla encouraged him, telling him to keep pushing forward and promised that she would support him with all her heart. Leaf, unsure of what to say next, called out Priscilla's name, but she quickly changed the subject, steering away from their previous conversation. With a teasing tone, she remarked that she had seen everything in front of him, leaving Leaf, despite his wisdom and knowledge, only able to stammer, in embarrassment. The next morning, everyone gathered to see Leaf off on his journey, despite his insistence that there was no need for a farewell. Bacchus cried loudly, clearly devastated by Leaf's departure, while a guard standing nearby coldly told him to quiet down. Leaf smiled and bid everyone farewell, offering some words of comfort to Bacchus. The king then asked about his plans. Leaf explained that Merlin had a grandchild who ran a shop in the capital, so he planned to visit them. Once again, the king expressed his heartfelt gratitude, and the queen acknowledged Leaf as the one who had saved her life. Hearing all these words of appreciation, Leaf calmly said his goodbyes and set off on his journey. As he was leaving, Priscilla stepped forward and called out his name, wishing him a safe journey. Turning around, Leaf saw her radiant smile and returned it, assuring her that he would come back. The queen teasingly commented to her daughter, asking why she wasn't going with him, to which Priscilla, smiling, admitted, "I've already fallen for him." The queen was taken aback for a moment, and Priscilla, flustered, quickly tried to deny it. But then, with a serious look, she said that when she looked into Leaf's eyes, she trusted him completely. She believed that he would become a great hero and save the world, and she couldn't stand in the way of someone so extraordinary. After all, he was the disciple of the legendary healer. Determined, Priscilla vowed to work hard so that she could one day be worthy of walking alongside him. Seeing her daughter's resolve, the queen smiled, proud of her. And with that, the events at the Duke Graham's estate came to an end. Leaf entered a rather old shop, known as the Comet Workshop. He politely apologized for the intrusion as he made his way inside. As he ventured further into the store, Leaf casually asked if anyone was there. Beside him were display shelves showcasing products, including some traditional Japanese dolls. One particular doll, a female with long black hair, appeared to be staring straight at Leaf. Leaf grew curious upon seeing what seemed to be some kind of tool and proceeded toward a door. He called out again, but received no answer, so he decided to open the door and step inside. As soon as the door opened, a scene before him left Leaf in shock. It was a large mess, a mixture of garbage and random items scattered all over the room. The smell hit him immediately, forcing him to cover his nose. Everything in the room was filthy. He moved some objects aside to clear a space to sit down, but Leaf was taken aback once more when he noticed a pair of women's underwear lying there. He picked it up, bewildered. Suddenly, a disheveled girl, holding her head in one hand and steadying herself against the wall with the other, staggered out. She was clearly suffering from a terrible headache, having been drunk for 2 days straight. Leaf blushed, startled to realize that Merlin's granddaughter was a girl. The girl wandered over to find something to drink. Quickly, Leaf handed her a glass of water. She downed it in one gulp, then smiled, wiping her mouth in satisfaction, clearly refreshed. Only now did it seem to hit her, and she loudly demanded to know who the person standing in front of her was, startling Leaf in the process. The girl, now covering her chest with both hands, started yelling, accusing Leaf of being a thief, a rapist, and a pervert. Leaf frantically tried to deny and explain himself, but his words fell on deaf ears. She insisted that he be quiet, declaring that all perverts deny being perverts. She then caught sight of Leaf holding her underwear, pointing it out as the most damning piece of evidence, leaving Leaf too embarrassed to speak. She launched into another tirade, convinced that Leaf was pretending to be innocent and had clearly broken the lock to get in. Leaf apologized, awkwardly laughing as he explained that the door wasn't locked at all. Both of them froze in realization. The girl, now on her hands and knees, groaned in self-criticism, blaming her drunkenness for forgetting to lock the door. Leaf was about to say something when he abruptly paused, his gaze falling on something. The girl's well-rounded backside was exposed beneath her thin underwear. Leaf screamed, causing the girl to jump in shock as well. The girl told Leaf to stop screaming so suddenly. Leaf, covering his face out of embarrassment from the earlier scene, mumbled that she was the real pervert here. He told her to put on some proper clothes, causing her to blush as well. She snapped back, asking what was wrong with her outfit. After all, this was her house, and yet he barged in and had the audacity to complain. Clearly, Leaf was the one lacking manners here. Leaf stammered, scratching his head, explaining that back in his village, people did things like this, so he acted naturally. The girl stared at Leaf, puzzled by his mention of back in the village. Hands on her hips, she began to piece things together. As she voiced her thoughts, she took a step toward Leaf, and without warning, she leaped onto him. However, things escalated quickly, creating an awkward situation as she ended up pressing her most sensitive parts against Leaf's mouth. Her face turned bright red, and she panted heavily. Leaf, lying underneath, was just as flustered, trying to speak, but she immediately silenced him, not even allowing him to breathe properly. The girl's name was Mercury Pendrago. After a while, she finally got dressed and came back out, sitting with her legs crossed on a chair to continue the conversation with Leaf. She commented that if he planned to visit today, he should have at least given some notice. She was surprised to learn that Leaf was from the hero's village. Mercury had already heard about him from her grandmother. Leaf bowed his head, introducing himself to Mercury, admitting he had many shortcomings, but hoping for her guidance in the future. Leaf looked slightly downcast as he responded, wearied from the many events that had unfolded. Mercury asked for his name again, pointing at him with a teasing smile, and remarked that he was really quite lucky. Leaf was puzzled by her comment. Mercury then revealed that she'd come to the capital because of some personal frustrations, but now she believed coming here had been the right choice. In this grand, magnificent city, there were countless things that couldn't be found in the countryside. Taking a step forward, Mercury explained that here she wasn't confined by any small boundaries and could do whatever she pleased. In other words, she turned back toward Leaf with a smile. From now on, you are free. She assured him that she would take care of him for a while. His room, his meals. Leaf could do whatever he wanted. After all, her grandmother had asked her to help him out. Leaf was moved by her words, but then Mercury asked him a pointed question. What do you truly desire? Leaf's eyes lit up with excitement, and without hesitation, he responded that he wanted to become an adventurer. In that case, Mercury suggested that Leaf should join a guild. She offered to introduce him to the guild she was a part of, and Leaf cheerfully agreed. Looking at Mercury's smiling face, Leaf assumed she must be a good person and breathed a sigh of relief. Mercury, observing Leaf's expression, thought to herself, "Is this the kid my grandmother likes?" She suddenly felt a bit disappointed. She had expected a child from the hero's village to be more impressive, but Leaf didn't seem like that at all. To her, he seemed quite ordinary. As she turned to leave, Mercury mused that maybe someone like Leaf would suit her after all. She waved her hand, wishing him a good night, and told him he could sleep wherever he liked. Leaf also wished her a good night. Then he looked at the messy room and wondered what Mercury meant by wherever he liked in this chaotic space. Rolling up his sleeves, Leaf began cleaning everything up. The next morning, when Mercury woke up, she found the room spotless and neat, which immediately made her suspicious. Leaf entered the room, greeting her with a good morning, and informing her that breakfast was ready, inviting her to join him. Mercury touched her cheek, feeling excited, and thanked Leaf as her stomach growled with hunger. However, her expression quickly changed, and she suddenly yelled at Leaf, demanding why he had cleaned up the room. Leaf was momentarily flustered. Mercury covered her face with both hands, complaining that she couldn't concentrate unless the room was dirty and cramped. "This clean place is not my room," she protested. Mercury threw open the window, threatening Leaf that she'd rather die than stay in a place like this. Leaf, shocked, quickly advised her not to act so hastily. Mercury insisted that she wanted everything to go back to the way it was, but all she got from Leaf was an apologetic smile. Scratching his head, Leaf sheepishly explained that he had already used C's special cleaning solution, which had essentially purified the room. Mercury froze for a moment at the mention of that name. Say, as in the person closest to the goddess, the Grand Holy Priestess Safer. Panic washed over Mercury. She quickly used her discerning eyes to scan the area. A glowing sign appeared before her, with the words, "Holy Land," clearly written. The Holy Land was not only a place that was impeccably clean, but also one where monsters couldn't approach. A world that was overly pure. So this really is a kid from that house, she thought. Leaf asked Mercury if something was wrong, bringing the first day of his arrival in the capital to a close. The guild's waiting hall was incredibly grand and spacious. For the first time in his life, Leaf was joining an adventurer's guild, and he was brimming with excitement at this new experience. He was warmly welcomed to the guild, Heavenly Grace Primordial Stone. Before Mercury could finish her sentence, Leaf was already skipping around, marveling at the high ceilings and luxurious atmosphere. He couldn't stop praising the place, saying it was like a dream to be able to join such a guild. Mercury stood to the side, deep in thought. Was it really a good idea to let Leaf join this guild? If he became popular, surely those no-good girls in the capital would flock to him. And if that happened, Mercury shuddered at the thought of her grandmother's terrifying wrath. She would surely kill her. Just as she was about to stop Leaf, he smiled brightly and waved her over, urging her to come to the reception desk. Mercury shook her head vigorously, trying to suppress her worries. Seeing Leaf's innocent and naive face, she simply couldn't be harsh with him. Suddenly, someone called out to Mercury. It was Nina, the receptionist, dressed in a beautiful gown. She waved at Mercury, saying it had been a while since they last met.
I think you kinda like this video, so just subscribe and like.